The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell. It wasn't even the sight of my best pasture drowning under filthy brown water. No, what hit me first was the laughter, hollow, cruel laughter from a group of HOA board members as they stood near the road, sipping coffee, watching raw sewage flood my family farm. Their trucks idled in the distance, their boots spotless, while my crops, my land, everything I had worked for, died under a tide of waste. I remember standing there, frozen, rage boiling so hot in my chest I thought I might combust. How do you fight back when the very people destroying you think they're untouchable? It started with a smell I couldn't quite place. Earthy at first, then sharp, then something far worse. I was walking the northern edge of the farm, inspecting the fresh shoots poking out from the early spring planting, when the breeze shifted and carried it to me, foul and heavy. I wrinkled my nose, scanning the fields, assuming maybe one of the compost piles had gone sour. But when I crested the small ridge overlooking the drainage culvert, what I saw made my stomach turn. A black slick was oozing down the gully, thick and unnatural, pooling into a low area meant to carry clean runoff toward the reservoir. My boots squelched in the mud as I made my way closer, heart hammering with a dread I couldn't explain yet. The water wasn't just dirty. It reeked of sewage, human waste, chemicals, rot. Panic surged through me as I followed the flow upstream, and that was when I saw the pipe. It was new. The soil around it was still loose from digging, the cheap plastic pipe crudely jammed into the drainage line that should have only carried rainwater. I knelt beside it, rage prickling at the edges of my vision, and saw the faded stamp on the pipe side. Community Utilities, HOA Drainage Improvement Project. HOA, our local homeowners association. They were supposed to maintain the tiny suburb 2 miles south of my farm, manicured lawns, identical houses, the whole fake paradise. They had no right to touch anything outside their subdivision, and certainly no right to reroute their filth onto my land. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the filthy water soaking into the roots of the spring wheat, the saplings I had planted just weeks earlier drowning in tainted sludge. I didn't just own this land. I depended on it. Dozens of families depended on it. My farm wasn't just some quaint rural holdover. It was a working enterprise, the beating heart of local produce markets, restaurants, and school lunch programs across 3 counties. Every carrot pulled from this soil, every crate of tomatoes shipped out of my barns, every pound of beef raised on this land, fed hundreds of people. And now, thanks to some bureaucrats with no respect for anything beyond their vinyl fences and beige aesthetics, all of it was at risk. I snapped photos of the pipe, the pooling waste, the markers staked into the ground, official-looking flags with Sunnybrook HOA project area printed on them. No signatures, no permits, no warnings, just an act of quiet, monstrous arrogance. Rain started to fall that afternoon, steady and cold, and I watched helplessly as the trickle became a stream. The fields nearest the pipe turned to sludge within hours, crops vanishing under a creeping tide of brown water. The next day, it rained harder. By midweek, the lowest pastures were drowning. I lost 20 acres in 3 days. 20 acres of cabbage, lettuce, and carrots I had promised to supply to the county school system. 20 acres that families were counting on to keep their kids fed. I called the county office, the utilities board, even the environmental health department, and each call ended in a frustrating maze of red tape. The HOA had claimed the project was authorized neighborhood maintenance. They didn't have to tell me. They didn't need my permission. They had pulled a permit for community runoff management, but failed to disclose they would be diverting the runoff into private farmland. When I asked who signed off on it, I was told to take it up with the HOA board. The board, a collection of suburban monarchs who thought their dog parks and flower beds entitled them to anything they could see from their golf carts. I wasn't about to take it up politely. I spent that night riding the fence line on my ATV, flashlight cutting through the mist, cataloging the damage. The south pasture, ruined. The new greenhouse, standing in 6 inches of water. Even my cattle fields weren't safe. The steers stood huddled on the highest ground they could find, confused and restless as the land they had grazed since calves turned into a swamp of filth beneath them. By dawn, the first animals got sick. Diarrhea, fever, weight loss. I called the vet, and when he tested the water, his face darkened. Fecal contamination, he said grimly. High levels. This isn't runoff. This is raw sewage. I felt something inside me harden then. A steel thread pulling tight. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate theft. They had stolen my land's future. They had stolen the sweat and years my family poured into this farm. I thought about the migrant workers who trusted me for steady jobs. I thought about the mothers who came to the farmers market on Saturdays to buy food fresh from the fields. I thought about my own daughter, whose college fund was tied to every crate of produce we shipped out. And I thought about the smug faces I'd seen driving by that week, HOA board members, clipboards in hand, checking the drainage project's progress without once stepping onto my property or asking permission. That was when the anger stopped being hot and became something colder, something focused. I knew then I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was about to go to war for everyone they thought they could trample. I spent the next day gathering evidence. Drone footage of the illegal pipe installation, soil samples marked and bagged, veterinary reports linking livestock illnesses directly to contaminated water. I even hired an independent environmental firm to conduct a survey documenting the rapid degradation of the ecosystem on my land. Every weed wilting under poisoned water, every dead sapling, every contaminated well. They thought they could drown me in their waste and walk away laughing. They thought I was just some dumb farmer with mud on his boots and no lawyer on speed dial. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I had spent years building something bigger than a farm. I had spent years becoming a keystone of the entire regional food supply chain. And now, they had kicked a hornet's nest they didn't even know existed. As the spring rains continued and the floodwaters rose, so did something else inside me. A tidal wave of resolve, cold and deep and unstoppable. They thought this was just a little accident. They didn't realize they had just triggered a disaster that was going to wash them away. I looked out over the ruined fields that night, the rain hissing against the sodden earth like a warning. They had poisoned my land. Now, it was my turn to poison their empire. Not with violence. Not with petty vandalism. With something much more devastating. Law, proof, public outrage, and power they couldn't even begin to fathom. I wiped the rain from my face, tasting the bitterness of it. No more phone calls. No more polite complaints. It was time to dig in. Time to fight back. Time to show them what happens when you dump sewage on the wrong man's land. I didn't walk into their meeting quietly. I made sure every single smug face at the Sunnybrook HOA board turned when I pushed open the community center doors, boots echoing across the fake hardwood, rain dripping from my coat onto their polished floors. The room was packed with residents, all there for the quarterly budget meeting, murmuring over coffee and donuts like it was a Sunday brunch instead of a battlefield. At the front, 5 board members sat behind a long table, papers stacked neatly before them. Smugness practically steaming off their pressed shirts and manicured nails. Diane Willoughby, the president, peered over her glasses with a smile so fake it should have been roped off with police tape. I walked straight to the center aisle, ignoring the whispering. I held up a manila folder stuffed with photos, reports, drone footage, and environmental studies. You, I said, my voice carrying across the room like a gunshot, dumped raw sewage onto my farm. Diane blinked, feigning confusion, tilting her head like a parrot hearing a new sound. I'm sorry, sir, but this is a community meeting. If you have concerns, you can schedule a private appointment with our compliance officer. Your compliance officer is knee-deep in a criminal violation. I shot back. I opened the folder, flipping through photo after photo of the illegal pipe, the flooded fields, the diseased cattle, the dying crops. I saw a few gasps ripple through the crowd, but Diane's expression didn't even flicker. As you can see, I said, holding up the environmental report, Sunnybrook HOA illegally rerouted a drainage line directly onto my private agricultural property without notice, consent, or permit. I tossed the photos onto their pristine table like dealing cards. You've poisoned my land, killed my crops, and endangered dozens of families' livelihoods. and I have every piece of evidence I need to take this to court." Diane picked up one of the photos between two fingers, like it was something she found stuck to her shoe. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with that practiced, oily condescension, "your property has always been subject to runoff collection. It's part of the county watershed management plan. There's a difference between rain runoff and a pipe pumping human waste into my fields," I said, teeth gritted. "We've simply enhanced the existing drainage infrastructure." Another board member, a pudgy man with thinning hair and a pinky ring, chimed in. "For the benefit of the entire neighborhood, of course. We filed all the necessary paperwork." "Where's the consent form for diverting it onto my land?" I demanded. Silence. Eyes flicked between each other. Diane smiled wider. "Sir, we recommend you consult with your attorney if you have further questions." A few chuckles rippled through the front rows. HOA loyalists who always clap the loudest at these puppet shows. I stood there, staring down a row of small-town tyrants who thought they could hide behind clipboards and bylaws. And just when I thought it couldn't get more absurd, they pulled their next trick. Diane motioned to the secretary, who produced a thick envelope and slid it across the table toward me like a dealer in a rigged game. "While you're here, Mr. Walker," she said, "you've been issued several compliance notices. We regret to inform you that your property is currently in violation of multiple landscaping standards outlined in the Sunnybrook HOA Community Harmony Guidebook." I stared at her, stunned. She actually had the gall to look me in the eye while she said it. "Landscaping standards?" I said, voice low. "You're fining me because your sewage ruined my farm. Your fields," she said sweetly, "no longer meet the approved aesthetic standards for properties bordering Sunnybrook jurisdiction. Patchy grass, standing water, damaged crops, it presents an unsightly view for our homeowners." She said it like she was discussing a slightly overgrown hedge, not acres of poisoned farmland. "Effective immediately," another board member chimed in, reading from a sheet of paper like he was announcing a weather advisory. "You are being assessed daily fines until your property is restored to an acceptable condition. $250 per day, retroactive to the date of initial noncompliance. March honest." I felt something fracture inside me, cold and permanent, retroactive. They had timed it. Set the trap, poisoned the land, then penalized me for the damage they caused. A slow smirk crept across Diane's face as she saw the realization hit me. "Of course," she added, her voice almost syrupy now, "if you have trouble paying the accumulated fines, Sunnybrook HOA offers mediation. In cases where property owners are unable to restore compliance, the HOA may assist in arranging property acquisitions at fair market rates." I froze. Property acquisitions. They didn't just want to dump their sewage. They wanted the land itself. Poison it, fine it, bankrupt me, then swoop in and buy it for pennies. It wasn't just greed. It was a long, calculated ambush. "You're trespassing," I said through gritted teeth. "You've destroyed private property." Diane tapped a manicured finger on the table, utterly unbothered. "You'll need to prove intent, prove damage, prove harm beyond normal environmental runoff exposure. It's a complicated case, Mr. Walker. Very expensive, very slow. Are you sure you're prepared for that kind of legal battle?" She leaned back in her chair, smiling like a snake sunning itself on a rock. "After all, you're just one man." I didn't speak. Not yet. I gathered the photos from the table one by one, slow and deliberate, never taking my eyes off her. The room buzzed with whispers, smirks, a few poorly hidden laughs. Let them laugh. Let them think they were invincible. They had no idea they had just handed me the rope to hang them all with. "I'll see you soon," I said quietly, each word a blade. Diane smiled wider, mistaking it for surrender. "Of course. Have a blessed day, Mr. Walker." As I walked out of the community center, I felt every eye on my back, felt the contempt and the arrogance rolling off them like heat waves. They thought I was finished. They thought I was beaten. They thought the muddy boots, the worn jacket, the tired face meant I didn't have the muscle to fight. They had no idea the arsenal they had just provoked. The minute I stepped outside, the cold spring air hit me like a slap, and with it came clarity sharper than any anger. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just a farmer. I was the lifeline of this entire county's food chain. And they had just endangered every restaurant, every school lunch, every grocery store shelf that depended on me. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was about public health, about environmental sabotage, about calculated economic warfare. They thought they could gaslight me into submission. They thought they could find me into selling. They thought I was alone, isolated, powerless. They had no idea that by poisoning my farm, they had just started a chain reaction that would burn their little kingdom to ash. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hand, feeling the stiff edges of the evidence I had gathered. No more warnings, no more negotiations, no more games. They chose this war. They chose to dig in. Now it was my turn to bring the storm. The stench was everywhere now. Not just in the low fields where the runoff had first invaded, but seeping into the barns, clinging to the walls of the greenhouses, poisoning the very air we breathed. I woke every morning to a new horror. Another steer lying motionless under the trees, ribs heaving, refusing to eat. Rows of wilted plants collapsing into the mud, their roots rotted and blackened. I had fought droughts, storms, and early frosts before. I had never fought something like this. Something invisible and insidious, something that killed everything it touched while the culprits sat dry and comfortable behind their suburban hedges. The worst part wasn't even the dying crops. It was the people, my workers, men and women who had trusted me for steady pay, who raised their families on the strength of this land, began getting sick too. It started with the children, tiny coughs that wouldn't go away, rashes rising red and angry along little arms and legs. Then came the fevers, the vomiting, the nosebleeds. Maria's daughter, Sophia, barely 4 years old, collapsed one afternoon while chasing chickens across the yard. Her lips were blue by the time I carried her to her mother, who sobbed wordlessly against my chest while I tried to force air into Sophia's tiny lungs. The doctor's report confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Waterborne pathogens, bacterial contamination consistent with human waste exposure. I paid for every medical bill out of my own pocket, furious and helpless. I installed fresh water tanks, brought in bottled supplies, flushed every line, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. And while I fought to keep my people safe, the HOA escalated their attacks. That week alone, I received 3 more citations. One for uncontained organic debris, when a pile of ruined vegetables rotted in the sun. Another for structural disrepair, when the flooded greenhouse finally collapsed under its own weight. And the last, the most insulting of all, a notice of public nuisance, stating that the malodor and unsightly decay of my fields was a threat to property values. Each notice came stapled to a fat invoice, fines stacking daily. I stopped counting after the first $20,000. Meanwhile, county inspectors began appearing at random. Not health officials, the ones I had been begging to intervene for weeks, but code enforcement officers, clipboard-wielding strangers who treated my farm like it was a condemned building in the middle of a city slum. One cited me for unauthorized agricultural expansion because a drainage ditch had overflowed into the adjacent pasture. Another fined me for non-conforming signage because the weathered farm stand sign, the one my grandfather carved decades ago, didn't meet updated visibility standards. They picked and picked, each paper cut designed to bleed me a little more. I knew where it came from. Diane and her board pulling strings with the county commissioner, the planning office, the petty tyrants desperate for favors from the Sunnybrook HOA elite. They weren't just trying to bankrupt me. They were trying to grind me into dust, to wear me down until I had no choice but to sell. I saw it in their smug little notices, in the way the inspectors avoided my eyes when they handed me citations. In the way the gossip mill in town began whispering about the eyesore out on Miller Road. It worked, too. Little by little, people stopped coming to the farm stand. Contracts for produce deliveries dried up, one polite cancellation after another. Parents who once trusted me to feed their children's lunches crossed the street when they saw me in town. I became the pariah, the failure, the contagion. I watched the farm unravel piece by piece, month by month. My foreman, Hector, a man who had worked beside me for 15 years, handed me his resignation one sweaty morning in July, eyes full of shame he didn't deserve. "I can't risk it anymore, boss," he said, voice breaking. "My son's sick. The doctors say it's the water." I shook his hand and watched him drive away, his pickup bouncing down the muddy road, the last link in a chain snapping loose. By August, the fields were a graveyard. Corn stalks blackened and drooping, tomato plants dissolved into mush. Even the hardy squash vines withered under the toxic flood. Every time it rained, the poison spread wider, and I had no money left to fight it. Every inspection fine, every code violation, every medical bill ate into the reserves I had scraped together for years. The loan payments on the new tractor came due. The seed orders I had placed on faith were still sitting in the barn, unopened, useless. I mortgaged the farmhouse to cover payroll for the workers who remained. I pawned my grandfather's antique rifle to buy bottled water for the families too scared to drink from their wells. Every night, I sat at the kitchen table under the buzzing fluorescent light, staring at spreadsheets that no longer added up, scratching numbers into the margins like a man digging his own grave one handful at a time. And still, the HOA kept coming. Letters arrived daily, cheerful in their cruelty. Perimeter landscaping non-compliance. Unauthorized livestock containment. Visual pollution from unapproved agricultural equipment. It didn't matter that the equipment was rusting under a tarp because I couldn't afford diesel. It didn't matter that the fencing violations were due to flooding that had torn posts from the ground. The machine had been set in motion, and it wasn't going to stop until I was buried. I realized one morning, standing ankle-deep in sludge where my best wheat field used to be, that they weren't just trying to destroy my farm. They were trying to erase it, to pave it over with their manicured dreamscapes and HOA-branded community gardens. They wanted me gone, not because of what I had done wrong, but because of what I represented: stubborn, dirty, inconvenient independence. I didn't fit into their beige, sanitized fantasy. I reminded them that the world wasn't theirs to fence and fertilize at will. That food didn't come from aisles in a grocery store. That land, real land, fought back. But I couldn't fight much longer. Not alone. Not bleeding out by 1,000 paper cuts while my crops died and my people suffered. One evening, as the sun bled across the poisoned fields, I sat on the porch steps, boots caked in filth, and stared at the farmhouse across the road, the one that had been in my family for 4 generations. I thought about my grandfather, who broke the first ground here with his bare hands and a mule. About my father, who taught me to mend fences and birth calves before I was 10 years old. About my daughter, who once chased fireflies across the south pasture, squealing with laughter. This land was more than soil and grass and crop rows. It was memory. It was blood. It was my legacy. And I was watching it rot away while the people responsible sipped their coffee and planned their next weekend garden party. That was the night I made the decision. I wasn't going to roll over. I wasn't going to quietly disappear under a mountain of fines and foreclosure notices. I was going to turn the storm they unleashed back on them, stronger, meaner, and utterly relentless. They had bled me dry. Now it was time to make them feel what it was like to lose everything. Brick by brick, dollar by dollar, reputation by reputation. They thought they understood power. They thought power came from rules and signatures and threats typed in 12-point font on HOA letterhead. They had no idea real power was rooted in the dirt they thought was beneath them. And they were about to find out exactly how deep my roots went. The next move wasn't made with anger. It was made with precision. Cold, patient, deliberate. For weeks I gathered everything I needed, working at night, under the dim kitchen light, the house dark and silent around me. I dug into old files, corporate records, purchase agreements, hidden partnerships that had been quietly building over the last decade. Because what the Sunnybrook HOA didn't know, what they had never even bothered to ask, was that the farm they were poisoning wasn't just a single patch of dirt stubbornly holding out against their development dreams. It was the root of something much larger, something woven into the bones of the entire county's food system. Years ago, when big city corporations started buying up family farms and squeezing out small producers, I had seen what was coming. I watched neighbors lose their land, their homes, their dignity. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen here. Not to my people, not to my name. So I bought quietly. At first, it was simple. a stake in the local produce distribution company, then a controlling share in the nearby dairy co-op. A few years later, a friend of my father's sold me his interest in the regional food processing plant, a dusty old facility on the edge of town that no one else wanted. I fixed it up, modernized it, turned it into a powerhouse. Under different LLCs and holding companies, I bought the cold storage warehouse by the interstate, the produce trucking company that supplied groceries across 3 counties, even a minority share in the organic certification agency that stamped approvals on every crate of tomatoes and box of lettuce moving out of the region. I didn't put my name on any of it. I didn't need to. Paper trails wound through shell corporations and family trusts, hiding my ownership behind layers even an ambitious lawyer would struggle to untangle. It wasn't about pride, it was about survival. About keeping control where it belonged. In the hands of someone who remembered that food wasn't just commerce, it was life. It was community. So when Diane Willoughby and her cronies dumped their waste into my land, they weren't just vandalizing one stubborn farmer's crops. They were contaminating the beating heart of the region's entire food network. Every head of lettuce, every jug of milk, every carton of strawberries that passed through my facilities could now be linked, legally, medically, scientifically, to a contaminated source. And that meant liability. Massive, existential, lawsuit-level liability. I didn't need to fight them with protests or petitions. I could bring their whole empire crashing down with a few well-placed phone calls and a stack of notarized documents. It began quietly. A tip to the State Health Department's Agricultural Division about potential contamination of local food processing centers. An anonymous packet of drone footage and lab results mailed to the regional EPA office. A friendly call to the director of the school lunch program who had been buying our produce for a decade, letting him know there might be an issue with supply chain integrity. And when the state inspectors rolled up, badges flashing, not to my farm but to the Sunnybrook HOA Community Center, the panic began. I stayed home that day, watching from the back porch as black government SUVs parked outside their little suburban fortress. Inspectors in blue windbreakers with clipboards and cameras marched up the pristine sidewalks, photographing storm drains, testing standing water, demanding paperwork that didn't exist because the entire project had been cooked up over coffee and backroom deals. Diane called an emergency board meeting that night, and I made sure every local reporter knew exactly where and when it was happening. Photos splashed across the news the next morning. Worried faces framed by the peeling vinyl siding of the Sunnybrook clubhouse. A reporter shoving a microphone at a HOA treasurer who looked ready to cry. Contamination crisis. HOA under investigation for food supply threat, the headlines blared, and that was only the beginning. I had documents, emails, financial records linking Sunnybrook's board members to the shady contractor who installed the illegal drainage line. I had proof that they knew their project would divert waste onto private land but had approved it anyway to save a few $1,000s in stormwater fees. I had sworn affidavits from former board members who had resigned in disgust months earlier, willing now to tell the truth to avoid being caught in the fallout. It didn't take long for the lawsuits to start flying. The school district sued first, desperate to shield themselves from any accusations of feeding contaminated produce to children. Then the State Agriculture Board filed a civil suit alleging reckless endangerment of regional food safety. And finally, the real hammer blow. The State Health Department issued an emergency shutdown order for the Sunnybrook HOA's water management systems. Citing imminent threats to public health, the subdivision was effectively quarantined. Their sprinkler systems were shut off. Their storm drains were sealed. Their parks were closed to the public. Property values plummeted overnight. Homeowners who once sipped wine smugly on manicured lawns were now trapped behind yellow caution tape, their neatly edged sidewalks stained with the same runoff they had unleashed onto my fields. News vans camped outside the subdivision entrance like vultures. Reporters shoved microphones into the faces of retirees in golf carts, desperate for angry sound bites. And Diane disappeared. Word was, she had fled to her sister's house 2 counties over, ducking subpoenas and pretending not to be home when process servers came knocking. The few remaining board members held a pathetic emergency meeting under a sagging tent in the park, begging residents for donations to fund their legal defense fund. No one showed up. No one donated. Meanwhile, I didn't say a word. I let the truth do the talking. I let the system they loved so much, the rules, the codes, the regulations, be the noose they hung themselves with. And the deeper the investigators dug, the worse it got. Illegal construction permits, misappropriated HOA funds, bribery whispers tied to the county planning board. Every rock they turned over revealed more rot, more corruption, more arrogance. Sunnybrook wasn't just guilty of poisoning my farm. They had built their entire little empire on lies and theft. And now, under the cold, relentless light of public scrutiny, it was all crumbling. It would have been easy to gloat, to march into the community center and sneer at the people who had tried to crush me. But I didn't. I stayed on my porch, watching the storm unfold. I didn't need to throw punches. I had already won. Their sewage had poisoned more than my fields. It had poisoned their reputations, their bank accounts, their futures. And the best part was that every time they tried to blame me, every time they cried foul or accused me of sabotage, they only drew more attention to the simple, devastating fact: they had done it to themselves. All I had done was let the truth breathe. In the end, they had handed me the rope. They had built the gallows. All I had to do was step back and let gravity do its work. It didn't end with them being exposed. Exposure was only the beginning. If they thought they could crawl away from the wreckage, slap a new coat of paint over their broken subdivision, and pretend nothing happened, they were about to learn the difference between damage and annihilation. The lawsuits hit like artillery shells. The state-level environmental charges weren't just fines or public shaming. They carried felony counts for the individuals who authorized the drainage reroute. Diane Willoughby, the queen bee of Sunnybrook, was named personally in the indictment. So were the treasurer, the secretary, and 2 other board members who had rubber-stamped the project to avoid paying county stormwater management fees. Each charge carried mandatory penalties, restitution, criminal liability, and, most importantly, asset seizure. I had made sure of it. Working with Mia, my cousin's daughter, a civil attorney with the tenacity of a pit bull, we filed a parallel civil suit alongside the state. Property damage, livelihood destruction, endangerment of public health, loss of income, emotional distress, agricultural sabotage. The list stretched 10 pages long. We didn't just name the HOA as an entity. We named every board member individually. And we didn't just go after their HOA funds. We went after their houses, their retirement accounts, their pensions. Every asset tied to their personal names was now on the table for seizure to pay for the environmental cleanup they caused. A court-appointed special master audited the HOA's books. What he found made even the most jaded county officials blanch. Misappropriated funds, fraudulent contracts, fake maintenance reports, a decade of small-town grift, wrapped up in neatly typed minutes and fake smiles. The county moved fast. They froze the HOA's accounts. They suspended the board. They issued a seizure order for any community assets to pay fines and restitution. Sunnybrook's parks, clubhouses, even the ornamental fountains at the entrances, all liquidated. Bulldozers rolled through a week later, flattening the tennis courts first, tearing down the vinyl community center next. Pieces of their fake paradise carted off in dumpsters. Residents woke up one morning to find "Property of County Public Works" stenciled in bold black letters across the once pristine lawns. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I wasn't interested in punishing the innocent homeowners who had been duped into paying dues to a criminal operation. I was interested in the ringleaders: Diane, Craig, Linda. The ones who laughed when I begged them to stop. The ones who thought they were too rich, too connected, too insulated to ever face consequences. Public records requests ensured every detail of their downfall splashed across the newspapers and TV screens. Mugshots of Diane Willoughby, her perfect helmet of hair frizzed and sagging. Photos of Craig Thompson being led out of a county courtroom, his tailored jacket wrinkled, hands cuffed tight. Sunnybrook became a national punchline. "The HOA that poisoned itself," read one headline. "Vinyl Kingdom falls to farmers' revenge," read another. Late-night talk shows picked it up. YouTubers made documentaries about it. The HOA horror forums exploded with memes of Sunnybrook signs half buried in sewage. Meanwhile, I went about my work quietly, rebuilding what they tried to destroy. I accepted emergency grants from the state's agricultural recovery program, fast-tracked by the media storm my case created, to replant the fields. A local nonprofit volunteered crews to help scrub the greenhouses and sanitize the barns. Dozens of volunteers, neighbors I barely knew, showed up on weekends with gloves, shovels, and buckets. People I hadn't seen in years drove out to the farm, bringing cases of bottled water, homemade meals, seeds to restart the next planting. Some apologized quietly, ashamed they had once crossed the street to avoid me. I didn't hold grudges. I handed them work gloves and a place on the line. We gutted the fields to the roots, stripping out every contaminated scrap of plant life, every spoiled inch of topsoil. We trucked in fresh earth. We purified the water lines. We scrubbed and planted and watered and prayed. And slowly, painfully, the land began to heal. By the first frost, new shoots of winter rye were pushing up through the clean soil, stubborn and green against the brown wreckage of the past season. The first calf born after the cleanup, a heifer we named Hope, came into the world strong and bawling, kicking against the cold air like she knew she had something to prove. I stood in the barn that night, watching her totter on new legs under the warm glow of the heat lamps, and felt something shift deep inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but peace. Real peace. Meanwhile, Sunnybrook officially dissolved. The HOA was formally disbanded, its charter revoked, its assets seized. The subdivision entered county receivership, its once proud gates swinging open to the public. Without the HOA's protection racket, property values tanked. Investors bought up the foreclosed homes at auction prices, flipping them into rental properties, senior living centers, anything to stem the bleeding. Diane's house went first. The marble-floored McMansion she lorded over the neighborhood with sold at a sheriff's auction for a fraction of its value. I didn't bid on it. I didn't need to. Watching her watch someone else drive a moving van up her driveway was enough. She didn't look at me when we passed each other on Main Street a few months later. Didn't even raise her head. She was a ghost now. An artifact of a kingdom built on arrogance and rot. And I was still here. My fields were still here. My people were still here. In the spring, we held a festival on the newly healed land. No tickets, no vendors, no politicians making speeches. Just music, food, laughter, and the warm smell of soil ready to bear fruit again. Families picnicked under the trees. Kids chased each other through the rows of young corn. Sophia, Maria's daughter, the little girl who had collapsed that terrible day, raced across the fields, healthy and strong, a blue ribbon fluttering from her hair. I stood at the edge of the crowd, boots planted in the earth, heart full to bursting, and realized something simple but profound. They hadn't just failed to destroy me. They had made me stronger. They had made us stronger. They had torn down everything false and left behind only what mattered. Real roots, real bonds, real community. No signatures, no bylaws, no fake promises. Just people willing to fight for each other, to build something that could never be bought or bullied away. And that's the thing they never understood. You can't kill something that grows from the ground up. You can poison it, you can burn it, you can try to pave it over with your concrete and your HOA rulebooks. But real roots, the kind that run deep, the kind watered with blood and sweat and stubborn hope, those roots always survive. They outlive the cowards. They outlive the tyrants. They outlive the plastic kingdoms and their paper crowns. I looked out over my farm, my home, and knew. They thought they were burying me. They didn't realize I was planting something. And now, it was blooming.